Hey everyone, so this is going to be the final video in our Afterlife series. Today we're going to talk about more of what it means to be changed by the resurrection. Before I get into the message though, I want to say a couple things. One, if you've been watching all these videos and it's been beneficial to you, I'm thrilled about that. I would love for you to let me know that you're seeing these and that they're beneficial to you. Just share that with me. One, it would just obviously make me feel good, but it lets me know that people are being reached by these and that this is an effective way to continue to reach you. My ultimate goal with this is to reach people who have not had the opportunity to come back to youth group or who can't come to youth group on Sundays but want to participate on Wednesdays, because we've changed our Wednesday night format at the Boone campus to be more of a continuation of what we're talking about on Sunday night. So this is to fill in that blank. If you can't come on Sundays but you want to come on Wednesdays, you can watch this to get a little bit of background on what we talked about and what we're going to continue to talk about. Another thing, it's a big announcement for right now. If you were planning on, Easter Sunday being your first night back to youth group, it's really important that you know that we are not going to have youth group on April 4th, which is Easter, or April 11th, which is the beginning of the Kenton County and Boone County spring break. So we always take a break during spring break so that you all have a chance to do things with your family. Maybe you're going to travel. And if you're going to do that, hopefully you're going to do that safely. But it also gives our small group leaders a chance to kind of rest and revive so they can continue to do the amazing work that they do. So no youth group April 4th or April 11th, but we will still get together on our Wednesday nights to have fellowship and to talk about some of the stuff that we've been learning at youth group. So hopefully you can make it out to that if you're available. So I'm going to start today's lesson with a question. I had people raise their hands at youth group. Obviously, I can't do that here, but if you have siblings, you're going to think about this. But even if you don't have siblings, think about people that have siblings, or maybe somebody in your life that's like a sibling, because it might be very similar. So I have an older brother, and for the most part, we were treated very equally in our family. I don't think that he got a ton of benefits from being the older brother. I don't think that I got a ton of benefits from being the younger brother. But there is one thing that I would say that we did pretty often, and that was blame each other for things. Now, the one benefit I would say that I got might be that if something happened and we were both in the room, my older brother was more likely to be the one who got in trouble for it. So let's say we're doing something and we break a lamp. It's obvious that my older brother would get the punishment or get the redirect because he's older. Why did you let your little brother do this? Why weren't you being careful? Or one, if I was late to school, I could usually use the excuse, well, David got up late and he took too long in the shower, or he was in my way, or he was being mean to me, or whatever. And for some reason, I'm late to school, but that blame would get cast on my brother. And I'm not saying that's right, but it was a benefit of having a sibling that you could sometimes put that blame onto. Right or wrong, it was good when I was a kid. Now, even if you don't have a sibling, you might know somebody like this. Maybe it's a pet. Something happens, you can blame it on the pet. A lamp breaks, your homework gets lost, it's easy to blame it on a pet. Maybe you have a friend and you were late to school because your friend was late picking you up, so it's their fault, not yours. Or maybe, I heard this one a lot when I was teaching, a teacher held me after class, that's why I'm late. So we all have these people that we kind of use to cast blame. It's something we all do. It's not just a kid thing, it's not a teenager thing or an adult thing, it's an everybody thing. Nobody likes to face the consequences for things that they've done, so we try to cast blame. So I want you to think about this. Do you remember the last time that you felt guilty? Maybe you copied a little too much of your friend's homework. Maybe you didn't tell your girlfriend or your boyfriend the whole story of what happened at the party. Maybe you lingered a little too long on a website you shouldn't have been on. Maybe you told your stepmom or your mom or your dad or your stepdad or your grandma or your grandpa that you were going to one place, and maybe that was true, but not with the same crowd that they expected you to be with. Or maybe you said you were studying the whole time, but really you had your book propped open and your phone was sitting there so you could watch Netflix. Or in today's world, maybe you had a tab open that had Netflix or Hulu or something on there that was distracting you. Now, we all have something that we're guilty about, that we feel guilty about. We all do things. The reality is, no matter how old you get, you do things that you feel guilty about, and you want to try to hide those things. The reality is, when we feel guilty, we get really good at hiding. And we all have different ways of doing this. Maybe we don't talk to our parents. Maybe we go straight to our room when we get home. Maybe we don't text our friends back. Maybe we stop going to church, stop going to small group. We have ways of hiding what we've done. And if you believe in God, chances are that you try to hide from him as well. Now, that doesn't necessarily make sense because we know God knows what we did is wrong, but we back away from our relationship with him. We know that he knows. There's no way to hide from him. If you believe that God is who he is, there's no way to hide what you've done from him. But we still try to hide. And no matter what that looks like for you, we all tend to let our guilt get in the way of our faith. I've met people who have stepped away from their faith because of their guilt. I've met people who have struggled with their faith because of the guilt. I've struggled with my faith because of guilt in my life. Now, when we look in scripture, there are plenty of stories of guilt, but for this series, we're looking at the resurrection, so we're going to keep with that, and we're going to focus on a story that comes around the time of the resurrection. We're going to continue talking about people who knew Jesus before and after the resurrection. So today we're going to talk about Peter. Peter was one of Jesus's closest friends. He was a leader among the disciples, but he still struggled with guilt because of some of his actions. Now, Peter loved Jesus. One of my favorite stories of Peter was that he cut a man's ear off because the person was making an advance towards Jesus. He was attacking Jesus. He was trying to take Jesus. So he cuts the man's ear off, and Jesus heals the man right there. But it shows you how protective Peter was of Jesus and how much he loved him. But despite his love, Peter still denied Jesus 3 times when it mattered the most. Now, Jesus told him he would do that. So to make matters worse, Jesus knew that he was going to deny him. He talked to him about that, and Peter denied that he would do it. But when the opportunity came to deny him, he did it, and he did it 3 times. Now imagine the guilt that Peter must have felt. He follows this man for years. He loves this man as a brother. He loves him as a teacher. He believes that he is who he says he is. Yet he denies him. When somebody says, "Do you know this man?" No. "Do you believe in this man?" No. "Do you follow this man?" No. And then he dies. So for at least a little while, the last thing that Peter did before Jesus died was deny him 3 times. I can't imagine the guilt that he must have faced during that. Now, we know the story. Jesus doesn't stay dead. He's resurrected. He comes back to life, and the disciples encounter him. So a few days later, the disciples encounter the resurrected Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. And while eating breakfast, Jesus brings up what was surely on Peter's mind. In John 21:15-17, it says this: "When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' 'Yes, Lord,' he said. 'You know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my lambs.' Again, Jesus said, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' He answered, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Take care of my sheep.' The 3rd time he said to him, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, 'Do you love me?' He said, 'Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my sheep.'" Now, this is a beautiful passage that shows the grace and the forgiveness of God. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but Jesus gives him the opportunity to reaffirm his love for him 3 times. And by doing this, he gives Peter a second chance. In doing so, he lets him know how much he's loved and that he is forgiven. And he even tells Peter to continue in his ministry. He says, "Feed my sheep." And then he gives him this calling to go out and make these disciples. So it's not just that he forgives him, it's that he gives him the second chance. He gives him the chance to redeem himself and to continue to do what he was called to do. Now, Peter was likely ready to give up on himself. He had denied Jesus 3 times. He had done a horrible thing, and Jesus is dead. And then he comes back, and there's still this tremendous guilt. He's probably ready to give up on himself, but Jesus was not ready to give up on Peter. Jesus didn't want Peter to live a life defined by his guilt. He didn't want him to live a life where he regretted what he'd done so much that he didn't continue to do ministry. Peter knew Jesus before his death, and he encountered him after his resurrection. Peter knew that this man had the power to forgive. That's important. It's no longer just a guy who is following. It is the Messiah who died and came back to life. He defeated death, so surely if he says you're forgiven, you are forgiven. Now, Jesus' resurrection proved that guilt did not have to destroy Peter's life. Instead, grace destroyed his guilt and reaffirmed his faith. Because of grace, Peter was no longer controlled by his guilt. Because of grace, Peter accepted the love Jesus offered him. Because of grace, Peter traveled around the world preaching about the same grace that changed his life. Because of the resurrection, Peter knew that he was forgiven. Now, if you're watching this and you're paying attention, there might be something that's popped up in your mind that you feel guilty about. A lot of times we try to hide our guilt. We try to push it down so far that we're never going to see it again. But when we talk about guilt during a message like this, it's easy for those things to pop back up. My intention is not to make you feel guilty. My intention is not to bring up old wounds or things that you're struggling with. But I think that it's important that you think about your guilt. How do you lose that guilt? How do you get rid of that guilt? How do you give that up to God? Here's a few things you can do. One, get real about where you feel the guilt. Like I said, guilt often subsides. It often hides within us, and we let it sit there, but then it bottles up, and eventually it's going to come back. We're going to struggle with that thing again. But if we're honest to God, it's the first step in getting rid of that guilt. So we're honest to ourselves, understanding why we feel guilty, and then taking that to God. And then remember, this is number 2, remember that guilt is no match for God's grace. If Christ could defeat death, then God's grace is powerful enough. We are forgiven. We don't have to live a life filled with guilt. We made a mistake. We ask for forgiveness, and then we move forward from that. We repent of that, and we move forward, and we try to be better, and we try to do better. Ask God to forgive you. If you haven't done that yet, ask God to forgive you and believe that he can, and you'll see that guilt start to leave you. And the third thing is keep showing up and speaking up. Guilt tells us to hide. Guilt tells us to leave. Guilt tells us to run away. But God tells us the opposite. If we come to him, if we go to our small group leaders, if we go to our pastors, if we go to our friends, and we share with them what we're struggling with, we ask God for forgiveness, we ask people to help us be better Christians and be better people, things are going to change. So if we keep showing up to small group, to school, to our friends, at home, in our families, and we keep speaking up and sharing what's on our hearts, then it'll be easier to trust that God is going to carry you through this and get you past your guilt. Guilt can be a huge weight, and there's no denying that. If you're feeling guilty for something, I understand how much you struggle with that. Like I said, I've struggled with guilt in my life. But I can tell you that the best thing that I've ever done is when I feel guilty for something, I take it to God, I'm honest with God about it, and I ask him for forgiveness. I don't always immediately feel better, but I start getting opportunities to make amends. I start getting opportunities to believe that I'm forgiven and that the grace of God is a real thing. So because of the resurrection, Peter knew that he was forgiven, and because of the resurrection, we know that we are forgiven. I hope that you believe that, and I hope that you can live that out to try to relieve some of that guilt in your life and get closer to Christ in the meantime. Have a wonderful week, everybody.